I trusted her with my deepest secrets, and that's when she took control of my entire life. Section 1. We met when neither of us was stable. The air in the hospital waiting room was thick with the scent of antiseptic and collective anxiety. It was 3 in the morning, a time when the world feels fragile and the people awake in it feel even thinner. I was sitting there staring at the flickering fluorescent light when I first saw Serena Vaughn. She wasn't crying. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, looking like a statue of a person who had forgotten how to breathe. We were two strangers bound by the same quiet desperation, waiting for news that might change the trajectory of our lives forever. My father was behind those double doors. Her sister was somewhere in the same wing. We didn't speak for hours, yet the silence between us felt more intimate than any conversation I had ever had. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were dark, hollow, and hauntingly beautiful. She asked me for a sip of my water, her voice barely a whisper, cracking under the weight of the night. I handed her the bottle, and our fingers brushed. A momentary contact that felt like an electric current in a dead room. That was the spark. We were both broken, both vulnerable, and both looking for something to hold on to while the floor fell out from under us. I felt a sudden, inexplicable need to protect her, even though I could barely keep myself together. It was a dangerous foundation for anything, but in that moment, I didn't care about the future. I only cared about the person sitting 3 inches away from me. In the weeks that followed, our trauma became our language. We met in coffee shops that were too loud for our quiet moods, and we spent hours walking through the city at night. I told her things I had never told anyone, the failures I kept hidden, the fears that kept me awake, the deep-seated insecurities that defined my private life. I felt safe with her. She listened with an intensity that I mistook for profound empathy, her head tilted, her gaze never wavering. I thought I was being seen for the first time in my life. I didn't realize I was actually being mapped. I was giving her the keys to every door in my psyche, believing she was building a home for us inside them. She had a way of drawing information out of me without ever seeming like she was prying. She would share small, tragic fragments of her own life stories, of a cold childhood and a string of betrayals, which made me feel like it was only fair to offer my own secrets in return. It was a trade, or so I thought. I told her about the financial mistakes I'd made early in my career, the messy details of my family's legal battles, and the exact things that made me feel small. I bared my soul because I believed that vulnerability was the only way to earn the kind of love I craved. I was building a pedestal for her out of my own weaknesses. The intimacy was addictive. We created a world that only existed for the two of us, a private bubble where the outside world couldn't reach. Serena became my anchor, the person I called before I even thought for myself. I felt a sense of loyalty that bordered on obsession. If she needed me, I was there. If she was sad, I was devastated. I was so consumed by the feeling of being us that I stopped paying attention to who she was when I wasn't looking. I didn't notice the way her eyes would go cold when I talked about my successes. I didn't see the way she was meticulously cataloging every confession I made. One evening, we were sitting on her balcony, the city lights shimmering below like fallen stars. She asked me if I ever worried that someone could use my past against me. I laughed it off, telling her that the only people who knew my past were people I trusted completely. She smiled then, a slow, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes, and told me that trust was a beautiful, fragile thing. I felt a slight chill, a momentary instinct screaming at me to stop talking, but I pushed it down. I wanted to believe in her more than I wanted to believe in my own intuition. Why would I doubt the person who had held me while I cried? As the months passed, the power dynamic began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. She started using my secrets as reminders during our small arguments. She would bring up my past failures not to comfort me, but to frame my current decisions. "Are you sure you want to do that, Miles? Remember what happened last time you trusted your gut?" It felt like concern, but it tasted like control. I was becoming dependent on her validation because she was the only one who knew how flawed I truly was. I felt lucky that someone like her could love someone like me. That was the trap. I was being convinced that I was lucky to be handled. I started to notice that Serena was becoming increasingly private while I was becoming an open book. When I asked her about her work or her friends, she would give me vague, polished answers. She was a ghost in her own life, while I was a loud, messy reality in hers. I began to feel like I was standing on a stage under a spotlight, and she was the only person in the audience, taking notes. I felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that I was being watched rather than loved. Was I a partner, or was I a project she was studying? The first real crack appeared when I overheard her talking to Claire Whitfield on the phone. They didn't know I was in the hallway. I heard Serena mention my name, followed by a detail about my family's legal history that I had shared in total confidence. She wasn't speaking with sympathy, she was speaking with leverage. She was using my trauma as social currency, a way to make herself seem more interesting or more powerful. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that the person I had shared my soul with was the same person who was dissecting it for sport. I didn't confront her that night. I walked back into the living room, sat down, and waited for her to finish her call. When she came back in, she was the same Serena, sweet, attentive, and soft. I looked at her and felt a wave of nausea. How much of our relationship was a performance? How many of my secrets had already been whispered into the ears of people I didn't even know? I realized then that my vulnerability wasn't equal to hers. It was her weapon. I was unarmed in a room with a woman who knew exactly where to strike to make it hurt the most. Had I signed my own death warrant by loving her? Section 2. Intimacy grows faster in the dark. The days following that discovery were a blur of calculated performance. I had to act as though nothing had changed, even though the foundation of my world had turned to sand. I watched Serena with a new, sharper focus. I noticed how she steered our conversations toward my vulnerabilities whenever she felt her own influence slipping. If I spent too much time with Daniel, my oldest friend, she would subtly remind me of how Daniel had let me down during my crisis. She was isolating me, using my own history to build a wall between me and the rest of the world. She wanted to be my only source of truth. I began to realize that Serena's love was a form of architectural engineering. She wasn't building a life with me, she was building a cage. Every secret I gave her was another bar in that cage. She knew about the panic attacks I'd had after the hospital. She knew about the debt I was still quietly paying off. She knew the exact words my father had said to me before he passed, words that still haunted my sleep. She held all of it, and because she held it, she felt she owned me. I saw it in the way she looked at me when I tried to assert my own will, a look that said, "Don't forget who knows the real you." We attended a dinner party at Logan Pierce's house a week later. Logan was a rising star in the corporate world, someone Serena clearly admired for his ruthlessness. Throughout the night, I felt Serena's hand on my arm, but it didn't feel supportive. It felt like a leash. Whenever I spoke, she would interject with a funny anecdote that actually highlighted a weakness of mine. To the others, it seemed like playful teasing between a close couple. To me, it was a public display of dominance. She was showing the room that she was the one in charge of my narrative. She was the gatekeeper of my dignity. I watched Logan watch her. There was a look of mutual understanding between them, a cold recognition of two predators who understood the value of information. I felt like a lamb at a table of wolves, realized that Serena had likely already shared my secrets with him too. The humiliation was silent, burning hot beneath my skin. I didn't fight back. I didn't argue. I simply sat there, smiled, and played the part of the devoted, slightly incompetent boyfriend. I was learning the power of silence. If she was going to use my words against me, I would stop giving her new ones. That night, back at the apartment, she tried to initiate intimacy. I looked at her and felt nothing but a profound sense of danger. She was beautiful, yes, but it was the beauty of a jagged glass edge. I realized that the addictive nature of our relationship was actually a trauma bond she had carefully cultivated. She had met me when I was at my lowest, and she had made sure I stayed there mentally, so I would never feel strong enough to leave. I lay there in the dark next to her, listening to her breathe, wondering if she ever truly loved me, or if she just loved the feeling of holding my life in her hands. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. I felt like I was walking through a minefield every time I spoke. I started to record our conversations in my head, analyzing them for hidden traps. I began to distance myself emotionally, retreating into a quiet internal space where she couldn't reach me. She noticed the shift immediately. Serena didn't like losing her grip. She became more aggressive with her reminders, bringing up my deepest shames with a casual cruelty that left me breathless. She was trying to provoke a reaction, to break my silence so she could find a new way in. I began to realize that she had secrets of her own, huge, gaping holes in her story that she had covered with the debris of my life. She had told me she was an orphan, but I found a letter from a woman claiming to be her mother, begging for money and forgiveness. She had told me she left her last job due to restructuring, but a casual search revealed a much darker story of workplace sabotage and a non-disclosure agreement. She was a master of projection. Everything she accused me of, dishonesty, instability, weakness, was a reflection of her own hidden reality. She was terrified of being found out. This realization changed everything. I wasn't just a victim. I was the bearer of her greatest fear. She had told me things in her moments of vulnerability. Small slips of the tongue, admissions of her own past manipulations that she now clearly regretted. She was trying to bury me so that her own secrets would stay buried with me. The intimacy that had grown in the dark was now a weapon for both of us, but only one of us knew it yet. I began to see that my silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a gathering of strength. I was collecting the pieces of her mask. I watched her interact with Claire and Eleanor Brooks, another one of her friends. I saw the way Serena manipulated them, playing them against each other with whispered lies and feigned concern. She was a puppet master who didn't realize she was standing on a stage with transparent curtains. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She thought she had won because she had my secrets. She didn't realize that by letting me into her life, even in her calculated way, she had given me hers. The question wasn't whether I would leave, but how. I knew that if I left loudly, she would use everything she had to destroy my reputation and my career. She would go to the people I cared about and tell them the truth about Miles Turner. I had to be smarter than that. I had to walk away in a way that left her paralyzed. I had to make her realize that the secrets I held were far more dangerous than the ones she held over me. I looked at her across the dinner table as she criticized my choice of wine, and I smiled. It was the first real smile I'd had in weeks. She asked me what was so funny. I told her I was just thinking about the future. Section 3. I realized my vulnerability wasn't equal to hers. The apartment felt smaller every day, a suffocating box filled with the echoes of my own confessions. I watched Serena move through the rooms with a grace that now felt predatory. She had a way of occupying space that made me feel like a guest in my own life. One morning, I found her sitting at my desk, casually scrolling through my old journals. She didn't even look up when I entered. She just commented on a passage from 3 years ago, a time when I was mourning my father's first stroke. She used it to point out a pattern of emotional instability in my character. I didn't yell. I didn't even ask her to move. I just stood there and watched her, realizing that she wasn't looking for understanding. She was looking for more ammunition. I began to see the hierarchy she had established. In her mind, she was the stable pillar, and I was the crumbling ruin she was graciously trying to restore. But it was all a lie. I started to pay attention to the phone calls she took in the bathroom with the fan running. I started to notice the way her hands trembled when I mentioned certain names from her past. My vulnerability was real. I had laid it bare in the hope of connection. Her vulnerability was a calculated performance, a series of scripted tragedies designed to mirror mine and create a false sense of equity. I had given her my blood. She had given me red ink. The pressure at work was mounting, and Serena knew exactly how to use it. I was up for a promotion at the firm, a position that would finally give me the financial independence I needed to move on. Instead of encouraging me, she began to plant seeds of doubt. She would mention, in passing, how stress always seemed to trigger my old habits. She would tell me that maybe I wasn't ready for the responsibility. One evening, she invited my boss, Eleanor Brooks, over for dinner without telling me until an hour before. Throughout the night, Serena subtly alluded to my difficult year and how proud she was of me for just showing up every day. She was sabotaging my professional image under the guise of being a supportive partner. I sat there watching Eleanor's expression shift from respect to pity. It was a masterclass in social assassination. Serena wasn't hitting me, she was erasing me. She was making sure that the world saw me through the lens she had created, a lens of fragility and hidden flaws. I realized then that if I stayed, there would be nothing left of the man I used to be. She was consuming my identity to feed her own need for control. Every time I tried to correct the narrative, she would give me a look of concerned disappointment that silenced me more effectively than any shout. She knew I wouldn't make a scene in public. She was banking on my decency to facilitate my own destruction. That night, after the guests left, the silence in the apartment was deafening. Serena was humming to herself as she cleared the plates, looking satisfied. I realized that her power over me was entirely dependent on my fear of being exposed. But what happened if I stopped being afraid? What happened if I accepted my flaws and realized they didn't give her the right to own me? I looked at the folder I had hidden in my briefcase, the one containing the records of her own financial discrepancies and the real reason she had fled her previous city. The power dynamic wasn't what she thought it was. I wasn't just a victim. I was a witness. I stayed silent because I needed her to believe she had already won. The more comfortable she felt, the more careless she became. She started leaving her laptop open, her phone unlocked. She assumed I was too broken, too unstable to ever look back at her. She didn't realize that the person she was treating like a patient was actually becoming a strategist. I was learning the geography of her lies. I understood now that she didn't just want to be loved, she wanted to be feared. And because I didn't fear her anymore, she was losing her grip without even knowing it. The trap was set, but she was the one walking into it. Section 4. Love turns dangerous when it learns too much. There is a specific kind of danger that arises when two people know everything about each other, but no longer trust one another. It's like living in a house made of explosives. Serena had become bold, almost arrogant, in her manipulation. She began to bring Logan Pierce around more often, using him as a benchmark to highlight my supposed inadequacies. Logan was everything she claimed to want: stoic, successful, and cold. She would flirt with him in front of me, then turn to me with a look of mock sympathy when she saw the hurt on my face. She was testing the limits of my endurance, trying to see how much I would swallow before I broke. I realized that the intimacy we once shared was now a roadmap for her cruelty. She knew exactly which buttons to push to make me feel small. She knew that my biggest fear was being seen as a failure, so she made sure I felt like one every single day. But I was watching her too. I noticed the way she avoided eye contact when I mentioned her old firm. I noticed the way she panicked when a letter arrived from a collection agency in her real name, not the one she used with me. The love that had once felt like a sanctuary had become a laboratory, and I was the scientist as much as the subject. I started to withdraw, not out of sadness, but as a tactical retreat. I stopped sharing my thoughts. I stopped reacting to her provocations. This drove her into a quiet frenzy. She needed my reaction to feel powerful. Without it, she was just a woman shouting into a vacuum. She tried to confess more to me, sharing darker, more twisted stories from her past to bait me into opening up again. She told me about a man she had ruined in her 20s, a story meant to warn me without saying it directly. I just nodded and told her I understood. I was recording every detail, every name, every date. One afternoon I came home early and found her in the bedroom, talking to Claire Woodfield. The door was ajar. Serena was laughing, a sharp, metallic sound. "He's so easy to manage," she said. "He thinks his secrets are his shame, but they're actually my leverage. He'll never leave. He's too afraid of who he'd be without me to tell him he's okay." Hearing those words didn't break my heart. It hardened it into a diamond. The last shred of emotional attachment I had for her evaporated in that hallway. I didn't feel betrayal. I felt a cold, predatory clarity. She had revealed her entire strategy. I realized that Serena's greatest weakness was her belief that I was as weak as she needed me to be. She had confused my patience for passivity. She had confused my silence for submission. She didn't realize that I was carrying everything she had ever confessed to me. The real version, the parts she'd slipped up on, the names she'd let fall when she was drunk or tired. I held her entire history in my head, and unlike her, I didn't need to talk about it to feel its power. I was becoming a ghost in her life, a silent observer waiting for the right moment to simply vanish. The psychological pressure reached a fever pitch during a weekend trip to a mountain cabin she had insisted on. It was isolated, quiet, and beautiful, the perfect setting for a final confrontation. She spent the entire first night trying to get me to break. She questioned my loyalty, my ambition, and my sanity. She used every secret I had ever given her, twisting them into a rope to hang me with. I sat by the fire, watching the flames, and said nothing. I let her talk until her voice went hoarse. I let her think she was winning. I let her believe I was at my lowest point. As the sun began to rise over the peaks, she looked at me with a mixture of contempt and triumph. "You have nothing left, Miles," she whispered. "No one would believe you if you tried to leave. I've made sure of that." I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I felt truly sorry for her. She was so obsessed with the leverage she had over me that she had completely forgotten about the leverage I had over her. I didn't need to destroy her reputation. I just needed to leave her with the knowledge that I knew exactly who she was. I stood up, walked to the door, and didn't look back. I realized that the ultimate power isn't in using someone's secrets. It's in the ability to walk away while you're still holding them. She thought she had me trapped in a cage of my own making, but she had actually built the cage around herself. By trying to control me, she had tied her fate to mine. And now, as I walked toward my car in the cold morning air, I was taking the only thing that gave her power, my presence. I was leaving her alone with her secrets, and for a woman like Serena, there is no greater nightmare than an audience that won't respond. Section 5. I walked away, carrying everything. She confessed. The departure was not a cinematic explosion. It was a surgical extraction. I had pre-packed my essential documents and a single bag of clothes weeks prior, hidden in the spare tire well of my car. While Serena slept in the cabin, convinced she had finally broken my spirit, I simply turned the key and drove. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a text. I blocked her number before I even reached the main highway. The silence that followed was the first breath of clean air I'd had in a year. I realized that my value wasn't tied to her perception of me, and her leverage only worked if I stayed in the room to hear it. By leaving, I had effectively disarmed every bomb she had planted in my life. I spent the first few days in a motel 3 states away, watching the phantom vibrations of a phone that no longer rang. I knew exactly what she was doing. She would be cycling through the stages of her manipulation. First, the worried messages to my friends, then the subtle hints to Eleanor Brooks that I had suffered a mental break, and finally, the direct threats disguised as concern. But I had already reached out to Daniel Moore and told him the truth. I didn't ask for help. I just gave him a sealed envelope and told him to open it only if I disappeared. For the first time, I was the one setting the terms of the engagement. The weight of her secrets sat in my mind like lead. I knew about the offshore account she used to hide money from her previous business partners. I knew the name of the man who had actually written her thesis. I knew the truth about the accident that had left her with a permanent settlement and a permanent lie. She had handed me these fragments in moments of arrogance, believing I was too far under her thumb to ever connect the dots. Now, those dots formed a map of her inevitable downfall. I didn't feel the need to leak them to the press or post them online. The power came from the fact that I held the match, and she was made of dry wood. I watched from a distance as my old life began to shift. Serena had tried to paint me as the villain, but without my reaction, her story started to loop and fray. People began to notice that I wasn't the unstable one. She was the one obsessed with a man who had simply moved on. Her social circle, including Logan Pierce, started to look at her differently. If I was as dangerous or broken as she claimed, why was I so quietly successful in my new city? Why was I so silent? My lack of retaliation was the loudest thing about me. It made her look like the architect of a ghost story that no one believed in anymore. I realized that by walking away with her secrets, I had left her in a state of permanent anxiety. Every time a stranger looked at her too long, every time a new colleague asked about her past, she would wonder if I'd spoken. She was trapped in the very paranoia she had tried to inflict on me. I didn't need to do a thing. Her own mind was doing the work for me. I started a new job under a different firm, focusing on the competence she tried to tell me I didn't have. I was rebuilding my life on a foundation of reality, while she was still trying to maintain a skyscraper made of illusions. The psychological shift was profound. I no longer felt the need to defend my past. I accepted the mistakes I'd made and the vulnerabilities I'd shown. They were part of me, but they didn't define me. Serena's mistake was thinking that my secrets were my weakness. She didn't realize that once I stopped being ashamed of them, they lost all their power. I was free, and she was the one looking over her shoulder. I had carried her baggage out the door, and now she was the one standing in an empty room, realizing she had nothing left to hold over anyone. Section 6. Time turns secrets into weight. 2 years passed like a slow, cleansing tide. I had moved to a coastal city, established a reputation for being reliable and discreet, and finally found a sense of peace that wasn't tied to someone else's approval. I rarely thought of Serena Vaughn, but when I did, it was with a clinical detachment. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved on to a new target, a younger executive who lacked my hard-earned cynicism. But the reports were different this time. People were starting to see the pattern. The mask she wore was beginning to slip more frequently, the cracks filled with the desperation of someone who knows their time is running out. I realized that time is the ultimate enemy of a liar. A lie requires constant maintenance. The truth just sits there, waiting. Serena had spent her life building a persona, but she had left too many witnesses behind. One evening, I received a cryptic email from Eleanor Brooks. She didn't ask for details, but she thanked me for my professionalism during a difficult time and mentioned that Serena's name had come up in a recent audit at her new firm. The past wasn't catching up to her because of me. It was catching up to her because she was the same person she had always been. My silence had simply allowed her the space to ruin herself. The internal monologue that used to be filled with Serena's voice was now entirely my own. I realized that the addiction I felt for her was actually a survival mechanism. I had been addicted to the hope that she would eventually be the person I wanted her to be. Once that hope died, the addiction vanished. I looked at the files I still kept, the evidence of her past, and felt no urge to use it. The true moral victory wasn't in her destruction, but in my indifference. I was no longer a character in her play. I was the audience member who had walked out halfway through and forgotten the ending. I began to see Serena's influence in the world like a fading radio signal. She reached out to me once through a burner account on a professional networking site. The message was short. I know what you're keeping. Don't think I've forgotten. I didn't even delete it. I just left it there, an unread notification from a ghost. It was a pathetic attempt to reestablish the power dynamic. She wanted me to be afraid. She wanted me to engage. But how do you threaten a man who has already let go of everything you think you own? I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that my lack of response would keep her awake for a week. The pressure she was feeling was evident in her social media, a curated, frantic display of success and happiness that looked more like a cry for help. I saw a photo of her with Logan Pierce, but they weren't looking at each other. They were both looking at the camera, posing for a world that was slowly losing interest. I realized that the silent dominance I had achieved wasn't about being better than her. It was about being beyond her. I had outgrown the narrow, petty world of leverage and betrayal. I was living a life that was quiet, competent, and real. One night, while walking along the pier, I realized that the secrets I carried were no longer a burden. They were a shield. Because I knew the truth about her, I was immune to her lies. Because I had survived her betrayal, I was immune to future humiliations. She had tried to break me, but she had accidentally tempered me. I was stronger, colder, and more focused than I had ever been. The love that had been a dangerous instrument of revenge was now just a distant memory of a lesson learned at a high price. I was ready for whatever came next, knowing that the heaviest weight in the world is a secret you're afraid will be told. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Section 7. She reached out when her past felt unsafe. The phone rang at 4 a.m, a ghost of a timing that sent a jolt of muscle memory through my chest. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The voicemail notification sat on my screen like a ticking clock, and I let it sit there for 3 hours while I drank my coffee and watched the sun climb over the horizon. When I finally played it, Serena's voice sounded different, thinner, stripped of its usual melodic control. She didn't lead with a threat or a charm. She sounded like someone who was finally realizing that the walls were closing in. "Miles," she whispered, "Logan is asking questions about the Seattle accounts. Someone told him things they shouldn't know. I need to know if it was you." I stayed silent because I knew that answering her was a form of defeat. She was drowning in the consequences of her own history, and her first instinct was to blame the only man she hadn't been able to fully break. I realized that she had lived the last few years in a state of constant, low-grade terror, waiting for the floor to drop. She had mistaken my silence for a long-form plan of attack, never considering that I simply didn't care enough to destroy her. To a manipulator, indifference is more terrifying than malice. If I hated her, She could still control me through that hate. But if I was indifferent, she had no handle left to grab. The internal monologue that used to be a frantic debate was now a calm, steady rhythm. I understood that Serena was facing a crisis of her own making. The Seattle accounts, she mentioned, were part of the financial mess she had tried to hide during our time together. Logan Pierce, ever the shark, had clearly sniffed blood in the water. She was reaching out to me because I was the only person who knew the full truth, and she needed to know if I was the source of her leak. I felt a surge of quiet power. I wasn't the one who had talked to Logan. He had likely figured it out himself, but Serena would never believe that. She was trapped in a prison of her own paranoia. As the day progressed, she sent more messages, each one more desperate than the last. She tried to appeal to our shared history, then to my good heart, and finally she reverted to the old Serena, the one who reminded me that she still had the records of my own family's legal struggles. I looked at the screen and realized how small she had become. The leverage she thought she held was ancient history, a collection of paper tigers that couldn't touch the man I had become. I realized that the psychological pressure had shifted entirely. I was the one holding the oxygen, and she was the one gasping for air in a room she had set on fire. I decided to send a single response. Not an explanation, not a defense, and certainly not a comfort. I typed, "I haven't thought about Seattle in years. You should probably worry about the people you're with now, not the person who left." It was the ultimate psychological strike. It told her two things: that I wasn't her enemy, and more importantly, that she wasn't important enough to be my enemy. I hit send and watched the read receipt appear instantly. I could almost feel her frustration through the glass. She wanted a war. I gave her a mirror. That evening, I received a call from Claire Whitfield. She sounded shaken, telling me that Serena was spiraling and accusing everyone of betrayal. I listened politely, but I didn't offer a single piece of information. I realized that by maintaining my silence, I was forcing Serena to face her own reflections. She couldn't blame me for her downfall if I wasn't even in the game. The dangerous love we had shared had finally completed its transformation. It wasn't an instrument of revenge that I had to swing like a sword. It was a weight she had chosen to carry until her knees finally buckled under the pressure of her own secrets. Section 8. What power feels like when you never use it. The final collapse of Serena Vaughan's carefully constructed world happened with a whimper, not a bang. I heard through professional channels that Logan Pierce had severed all ties with her, and a quiet settlement had been reached regarding her financial discrepancies. She disappeared from the social circles we once shared, retreating into a forced anonymity that must have felt like death to her. I sat in my office, looking out at the city where I had built a life based on competence rather than leverage. I realized that the true moral victory wasn't seeing her fail. It was the fact that her failure no longer gave me any emotional satisfaction. I was finally, truly free. I realized that power, in its purest form, is the things you choose not to do. I could have ruined her a dozen times over. I could have sent the files I held to Logan, to Eleanor, or to the authorities. But doing so would have kept me tethered to her. It would have made me another version of her. By choosing to stay silent, by choosing to walk away and stay away, I had preserved my own integrity. The secrets she had entrusted me with were still mine to keep, but they no longer felt like weapons. They felt like artifacts from a previous life, dusty and irrelevant. I had outlived the trauma that had once defined me. The final emotion I felt was a quiet, steady satisfaction. I had walked into that hospital waiting room years ago as a broken man, and I had emerged from the wreckage of Serena's love as someone whole. She had tried to use my vulnerability as control, but she had inadvertently taught me that true strength is the ability to be vulnerable and survive the consequences. I looked at the folder of her secrets one last time before shredding every page. I didn't need them anymore. The leverage was gone because the connection was gone. I was the master of my own narrative, and she was just a footnote in a chapter I had already finished. I stayed silent not out of fear, but out of dignity. Serena had spent her life trying to manage how people saw her, while I had spent my time becoming someone worth seeing. The power shift was complete. She was now the one who was unstable, the one who was broken, the one who was dangerous to know. I didn't have to say a word to make it happen. I just had to live a life that was better than the one she tried to trap me in. Time and distance had turned her secrets into weight, and she was the only one left to carry it. Love had been the quiet instrument of revenge, but the revenge wasn't her pain. It was my peace. As I walked out of my office and into the cool evening air, I felt a sense of profound clarity. I thought of Miles Turner, the man who had shared his soul in the dark, and I felt a deep respect for him. He had been brave enough to love, and I was strong enough to survive it. Serena Vaughn was somewhere out there, likely trying to build a new cage for someone else, but she would never be able to touch me again. I had taken the only thing that mattered, my own identity, and I had kept it safe. That was the moment I understood that the greatest victory isn't winning the game, it's realizing you no longer need to play. The story ends here, not with a shout of triumph, but with the sound of a door closing softly on the past. I am no longer defined by what she knows about me or what I know about her. I am defined by the silence I chose to maintain and the life I chose to build in its place. I am Miles Turner, and I am finally, completely, my own. The secrets are gone, the weight is lifted, and the horizon is clear. I walked away carrying everything, and in doing so, I realized I didn't need to carry anything at all. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.